In this tutorial, we'll go over the basics of JavaScript, and in order to do that, we have to touch on HTML. So there's a couple of tools that we're going to be using. One is jsbin.com, and what this will do is take the place of some of our other development tools, which is basically a notepad program and a web browser. jsbin.com actually has the notepad section over here and the web browser over here, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Also, we'll talk about the basics of the file structure of a website. So the first thing to notice is when I load up jsbin.com, again we have two sides of the screen. On the left is just a text document, and it says HTML. However, HTML is just a type of text file like Notepad can create. On the right hand side where it says output, this is actually working exactly as your web browser does, whether it's Firefox, Google Chrome, Internet Explorer, Safari, whatever. When you create websites, whether it's HTML or JavaScript, your browser does the job of converting this code over here that's in text into graphics on your screen. So each little tag, as it's called here, in the HTML code is important and does something specific. Whenever you go to jsbin.com, it will automatically load up this template for you here. It will populate the text with this side, the text side with this text. If you opened up Notepad, for instance, on your computer, again, you don't need jsbin.com or even internet connection to build a website and test it and play with JavaScript. But if you open Notepad, it would not give you this text. It would just be a blank document. So you would have to type this text in there. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at different pieces of a web page. Here. So a web page starts out with first the doc type, and then the HTML tag. Now, when you have this tag, everything between this tag and the / HTML tag, everything in between those two is being affected by those tags. So that's what the tags are kind of demarking the beginning and end of a certain section of the code. Similarly, the next line here, the head, demarks the header of the web page. So we have from here until /head. That means end head or end header. In between that, we have a couple of other tags. This is a meta tag, which actually it isn't really required, so we're not going to look too much into that. And the title tag. So the title is the title of the web page. For instance, if you look up at this tab here, it says JSBin. That is what the title actually is. So we can change that text. So if I change that text, JSBin automatically will update. So now my tab up here says test code. In the body, from this line to this line, that is the actual main body of my web page. That's where everything is going to be displayed. So if I were, for instance, to just type some text here, the default for HTML is text with no special tags specifically around it that lives in the body of the HTML code. Just gets printed to the screen. And technically, if I just did this in Notepad, I'll do this. if I just type text, it'll just display that directly in the web browser. But I'm going to go back to, just hit Control-Z to go back to this. If I wanted to change this text in some way, I can add specific tags for text. So for instance, if I wanted to make this like a section heading, oops, and then I wanted to say add, this is text in a paragraph form. Well, right now it doesn't even show that I've jumped down to the next line, which is not really good. I want to be able to show that I want this to be a section heading, which is like maybe bold and larger, and then this is just smaller text. The way that I would do that is adding some tags. So the first tag I'm going to do is using h1, which is a header tag, and I'm going to put that just on my section heading. So now you can see it's updated and made my section heading large. There are other headings as well. H2 is slightly smaller, H3 slightly smaller again, and so forth. And then the text down here, if we want to force this to be what's called paragraph text, we can put the P for paragraph tags around it. So now we have section heading and this is paragraph form. Well, what if during my paragraph form I wanted to jump to the next line and say line number 2 of the paragraph? How do I make this text correspond to the way that I have this laid out? Well, there's a couple of things I can do. I can create 2 paragraphs and do it that way. And I can also use a single line that's called a break. So that is /br, and that will automatically just put a new line here. It basically just makes the text go to the next line. This is going to be useful whenever we're playing with our JavaScript here in a moment. So the first thing that I'll say about the JavaScript is we're going to be interacting with parts of the web page itself, and then we're going to be running code, running the script separately. So what we're going to have to do is create objects in HTML code, and then we're going to go into the header and create our script that will actually perform some action. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'll delete this text, and let's build a simple calculator. So I'm going to say header simple calculator, and then I'll make a paragraph that describes how to use it. So I put inner values in the 2 text boxes and press the button to see the result. Well, I don't have any text boxes or buttons over here yet. So let's go ahead and add these. And what I'm going to do is put a few specialized tags. And these tags are allowing me to create a text box. So right now I just had to put input type text, and it created a text box, which is an input. I'm going to name this text box input 1. Forgot to put the quotation marks. I'm going to give it an ID, and I'm also going to name that input1, just for simplicity's sake. And then I'm going to close that input tag. I am then going to put a plus sign, and again, technically I don't need to put that in a separate paragraph right now because I could just type it directly and it would display. In fact, I'll show you that. If I just put a plus sign, you can see it moved up here because I didn't put a break, but if I put a break, it jumps down to the bottom. But either way works. So I'll just leave it as a plus sign. And then I'll put another text box. And I'm going to name this one input 2. Oops. Don't forget to close your quotation marks there. Okay, so I have 2 text boxes and I need a button. So let's put another input. Oops, you gotta put the tag, otherwise it thinks you're just writing text. And I'm going to make this of a different type. I'm going to make it a submit type. And that's going to allow me to make a button. I'm going to name it enter button, or rather, I'll name it calculate button. I'll give it the ID of calculate button. Notice I'm not using any spaces in these. I like to have no spaces and then capitalize the beginning of the next word if it's multiple words put together. And what I'm going to do is create an extra thing called on click. So on the click of this button, I want this to do a particular thing, and I'm going to call this calculate function. And I got to put these parentheses there. And then I'm going to give this button a value, and that value is going to be what's written in the button. So I'm going to say calculate now. And then of course close the input tag there. Looks like I have an extra quotation mark here. That should be 8. We'll just delete that. Okay, so I've created these text boxes and a button, and I can put values in them and click the button, but nothing happens. All I've done is created these little areas for me to get data from. Now I actually have to build something that does something with this data. So the first thing I'm going to do is come up here and create a new JavaScript tag, and then I'm going to create the end script tag, and I'm going to put all of my JavaScript in here. Now with JavaScript you can do / and create comments, which are ignored by the compiler or by the web browser. It doesn't try to execute these. It knows if it sees / everything behind that is a comment. I always encourage you to put comments in your code. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build the function that I talk about here, calculate function. So inside my script, I'm going to say function calculate function, and then I'm going to have an open curly brace and a close curly brace. Everything inside these curly braces is that function. Whatever methods you want to have done, whatever calculations you want to have done in JavaScript, whenever that button is clicked, you want to put in between this curly brace and that curly brace. You can kind of think of those curly braces like we have these tags, where we have the open script, end script tag. We've got the function with this name, calculate function, and then we have open curly brace, close curly brace. So what do we want to do whenever this button is clicked? Well, the first thing we want to do is get the values from these two text boxes and then add them together and then display it. So I'm going to write that as comments. So I'll get the value from first text box, get the value from the second text box, oops, add those two values, print the result to the page. So let's go ahead and work on this step by step. So how are we going to get the value from the first text box? Well, let's create a place to put the value from the text box first. So we're going to create what's called a variable, and a variable is just a named bit of memory that holds some value. So I'm going to name this this first variable here, we'll call it A, and we will say that's equal to, and then I'm going to type a little bit of magic here, document dot get element by ID. I'm going to put some quotation marks and then dot value. So what this bit of code here does is it's going to look at the entire document. It's going to search by the ID that we've given one of the options, and it's going to return the value of it and store it into this variable. So if we look, what is the first text box's ID? Well, if we go back down here, input 1, that's the name of our ID. And in fact, I'm going to add ID to the IDs to differentiate it just from the name. And however we type this, it has to be typed the same way. We want to make sure that it's, whatever this is, that's what we're putting in here. So if we read this line backwards, it makes a little bit more sense. So we want to get the value of input 1 ID from this document. And so that means looking at this document, find the thing that's got the ID called input 1 ID, and then we want to get the value of it. And we're setting our variable equal to that value. So we're just putting that value inside there. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do, I'm going to say variable B. I'm going to do the exact same thing. And I'm just going to copy and paste this. But instead of looking at input 1, let's look at input 2, because that's our second text box here. So now we've got the value of input 1, this box, and the value of input 2, that box. Now we need to add these two together. So I'm going to make another variable, call it sum, and have it equal to basically the values of A plus B. Now, the way that we read these in, this input type is text. If I type a number in there, it doesn't represent the integer value of that number. It actually represents the character of a 2. And a 2 is just like a letter on your keyboard. It doesn't have any intrinsic value associated with it if it is text. So what we have to do is we want to convert this to a number. And there's different kinds of variables that we want to use. Text is one variable. We want to use what's called a float, or a floating point number. That's basically any decimal point number. And so I'm going to write parsefloat, which means take the thing that I'm going to give you in these parentheses and convert it into a float. And I'm going to put value of A in there, and then a plus sign. I'm going to parse float value B. And so, also, never forget to put these semicolons at the end. It will frustrate you to no end if you don't have those. But basically what I'm saying is take the text that's in A and convert it to an actual number I can use, and then take the text in B, convert it to an actual number I can use, and add those two together, store it in sum. Finally, we want to print this to the screen. And there's several different ways to go about doing this. One way that I like to do it is document.write, and then write the name of our variable. And so let's try it out now. If I say 1 plus 2, click calculate now, it gives us 3. Well, that now has changed our page. We can't see our page anymore. So maybe that's not the best way to do that. We want to be able to calculate more numbers than that. But for the moment, that works. That gives us the result that we were looking for. So let me highlight all of this code just to make sure I have a copy of it. And I want to click Run with JavaScript again here. And what this does is basically reset. It reloads that page internally. But I mentioned we don't have to have this in jsbin.com. In fact, we could do this in Notepad. So I've copied this code. I'm going to run Notepad and just paste it in here. You can see it doesn't do this fancy highlighting things different colors or anything like that. But nonetheless, it will render our text correctly. You do not want to use something like Word or WordPad for this, because that actually will change the type of text that it is. It's not a standard plain text document. When we save this, we want to click on Save File Type As All Files, and then we want to name this simple calc.html. The .html is very important. So we're going to save this, and I'm going to put it in my desktop here. And if I go to my desktop, I have simple calc.html. And if I just open it in Chrome, double click, my calculator pops up. And I can add numbers. So 4 plus 5, calculate now, gives me the result of 9. But this isn't on the internet. This is actually a file. If it were on the internet, it would be HTTP in the address bar, but here it's file, and then it gives me the full path on my hard drive to that particular file. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of this we're going to talk about absolute and relative file paths. This is what's called an absolute file path. It gives me the exact direct file path to that file. If I were trying to refer, like say I had an image on my main page or something like that, I don't have to give it exactly this entire file path. All I have to do is give it a relative path, which means that it assumes that the image that I would be placing here is in the same place, C, users, a laptop, desktop, as this particular file, which is the simple calc.html file. So if I'm doing a relative file path, I can ignore all of this and just type the last part here. We're not going to really do that in this tutorial, but nonetheless, that's how it works. So let's close this and go back to our JS bin. Now that we've done a simple formula here, some A plus B, we can actually change this and make this a different function. So what if I wanted to multiply? Enter values and press the button to see the result. That's fine, and I'm going to change this to put a big X here so it looks like a multiply. And so now I've changed this to multiply, changed this to show that I'm going to multiply. All I have to do is say 3 and 4 as my inputs, and I output at 12. So that's correct, it's multiplying. Here you could put any values you can, or any formula really, you can think of in here. If you want to do scales, if you want to do unit conversion, if you want to do anything. That's all computing really is scaling and changing numbers. So this is a very simple introduction here for how to go about doing JavaScript web pages. So I'm going to actually simplify this so that you could see all of this on one document here. And I usually like to keep the spacing as I had it because it makes it easier to read. But if you pause your video, you'd be able to type this in if you hadn't, typed it along the way. And you'll have this simple calculator to start with. Of course, JavaScript can get much, much more complicated, but this is the very core, the very basics of JavaScript.